His fever drives him to a lofty plane. In madness, half suspected on his part, he hankers after heaven's loveliest orbs, demands from earth the choicest joy and art, and, far and near, what pleases and absorbs, still fails to satisfy his heart. Goethe's Faust, one of the most famous legends of Western history, tells the tale of a scholar selling his soul to the devil in pursuit of a narcissistic and ultimately self-destructive transcendence. This first drama is at the same time a manifesto and a critique of Romanticism, a movement that sought transcendence not through the embrace of God or through reason, but by means of the intensity of passion. Welcome to the Great Conversation podcast. I'm your humble host, Adrian Joseph, and today I'm equally honored and delighted to be joined by Dr. Gesa Singer from the University of Cape Town to discuss Goethe's Faust. Dr. Singer completed her master's in Germanistics and pedagogy at the George August University of Göttingen and obtained her PhD at the Karl von Ossietzky University in Oldenburg. She has taught German as a foreign language at the University of Cape Town since 2001, and her research interests include the didactics of German as a foreign language, intercultural German studies, and the literature of migration, exile, and travel. Dr. Singer, welcome to the Great Conversation podcast, and thank you for taking time to be here today.
Thank you so much, Adrian.
Let us start by talking a bit about Romanticism in Germany. Goethe was one of the greatest writers of the golden age of German literature, and Romanticism played a key role in the development of this new form of German literature, which occurred during the so-called storm and stress period of the 1770s, which was marked by romantic tendencies of a trio of great writers who were to dominate the literature of their time, being Herder, Goethe, and Schiller. But the rise of new German literature was also characterized by an appreciation and an understanding of classical writers, or original classics, especially the Greeks, rather than of the modern neoclassicists. The Romantics espoused imagination, feeling, passion, and individuality as against the decorum, rules, and universality of the neoclassicists. My first question then for you, Doctor, is whether Faust celebrates the Romantic spirit. What is Faust's viewpoint of Romanticism? Is he for Romanticism, against Romanticism, or perhaps both?
Very interesting and complicated question indeed, because firstly, I'd like to mention that we as scientists or specialists in the field of literature, we sometimes tend to look at epochs in a way that we want to find specifics of these epochs in the works. But while these works have been written, the authors were not always aware of how we later on would call these epochs. But for sure, there are tendencies, and many of them that you have mentioned, that are present in this work. The Romantic spirit especially is often misunderstood in a way, in the sense that it could be all about romantic love. But as we can see in most of Goethe's works, and especially in this tragic play, romantic love is destroyed and is shown as impossible, actually. The very contradictory tendencies that play throughout the Romantic phase can be seen in different authors, and some of those even opposed Goethe by that time when he became a classical writer and part of the establishment, also in his political. But his figure, Faust, conveys many of those layers that you have mentioned. So he is a universal scholar. So he portrays part of the atmosphere that shows developments in sciences and philosophic tendencies that want to explore more of humankind than one could ever have thought of before. On the other hand, there's a strong tendency to look backwards into the Middle Ages and the Antiquity, as you have also mentioned. And this is more visible even in the second part of Faust, but unfortunately we won't have the time to discuss all of that. Is Faust a romantic person? One could say no, because as we will see in his pact with Mephisto, he's rather interested in gaining or achieving more of pleasures, of worldly pleasures, and expansion of his feelings and physical sensations. But in a more philosophical way, he represents these crucial times between the dark ages like medieval times and the Enlightenment that will lead to more critical thinking.
Goethe was open to many varied influences. He believed that paganism and Christianity, ancient and medieval culture, and all the creative achievements of artists, scientists, and philosophers were valuable and meaningful, and that they should be assimilated and welded into the culture and thought of the modern world. He actually considered this assimilative capacity as essential to creative genius. This openness to all forms of culture and experience was a decidedly romantic feature, and it definitely characterizes certain parts of Goethe's masterpiece, Faust. In his last letter, written 2 weeks before his death, he says, and I quote, "The best genius is that which absorbs and assimilates everything without doing the least violence to its fundamental destiny, that which we call character, but rather improving and enhancing it as far as possible. Through training, instruction, contemplation, success, failure, advancement, hindrance, and ever more contemplation, the organs of man in their instinctive free activity unite the acquired with the innate to produce a harmonious unity that astonishes the world." And I think we can see this harmonious unity that astonishes the world in Goethe's Faust. But moving on to the second part now, let's talk a bit about staging Goethe's Faust. Part one, as we've already said, deals with the compact between Faust and Mephistopheles and his tragic love affair with Gretchen, which is Goethe's own addition to the Faust story or to the Faust legend. 2 short scenes precede the beginning of part one, the prelude on the stage and the prologue in heaven. In the prelude, Goethe deals with the problems of a theatrical producer who wants to present a drama that will have meaning and at the same time please the audience. Goethe was indeed himself a theatrical director. And this is a very delightful scene with the manager, the poet, and Gesa presenting their clashing viewpoints and hinting at a few of the themes that will later come in the drama, foreshadowing them. It ends with the manager's call to stage this cosmic drama of Faust. He says, "Thus in our narrow house of boards preside, and through all creation circle stride, and wander on, with speed considered well, from heaven through the world to hell." My second question then for you, Doctor, is can we envisage Faust as a stage play? We know that part one was staged at Weimar during Goethe's lifetime. We know there are opera performances which present portions of part one dealing with the love story of Faust and Gretchen. Could we see Faust be presented on stage as a whole in actual theatrical performance? And which scenes in part one do you think are especially fitted for the stage, and which scenes do you think would be more difficult to present?
Yes, of course. This play was designed to be staged, basically. We shall not forget that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was a playwright. And in one of the first efforts to put it on stage, he was actually involved, being in his 80s already. So he wanted details to be played out in a certain way. On the other hand, it has often been mentioned that it's basically unstageable because some of the scenes like that Vulpergus Nacht, where the witches dance on the Brocken, the famous hill in a region in middle Germany, is very hard to be staged, and other scenes as well that would need many folk scenes, for instance, like that of the Easter Sunday walk, etc. And also when it comes to the magic scenery, it sometimes turns out to be a bit superficial or even unwillingly funny when you see the poodle that becomes a Satan figure like Mephisto. But there, as you said, there have been many famous attempts to actually adapt text for stage play in different forms and variations with and without music. And the one that comes to my mind definitely is that one with the famous actor Bruno Ganz that went over several days and in different halls and comprised actually both parts of Faust, and that was a very huge event. I think all of the stage performances have been intensely criticized due to many different reasons.
Moving on to our third section, which deals with religious influences. In the second preliminary scene in imitation of the book of Job, which is also an episode we've done on the Great Conversation podcast, this scene shows Mephistopheles wagering that he can tempt the Lord's servant Faust to follow evil. The Lord agrees to the wager, pointing out that man needs, quote, the spirits of negation to stir him to creative activity. The Lord is not disturbed at Faust's present confused and restless state. He says, man errs as long as he doth strive, and yet if he is good, remains aware that there is indeed one right way. And this notion that human striving and error lead to ultimate rightness becomes a basic theme of Faust. Joseph Dennis Enright, in his book entitled The Commentary on Goethe's Faust, has this to say: the one clear fact that emerges from the prologue is this: the drama is to turn on the question of whether man is a successful creation, whether the Lord's experiment in crossing the angelic with the animal has produced a form of life which is a useful advance on the emptiness of chaos. Will Faust, as a representative man, under temptation, and more than that, during the enactment of evil, still retain his divine acknowledgement of the distinction between good and evil? The issue at stake is not whether Faust can resist evil desires. Obviously he cannot, but whether he can be brought into an absolute and genuine unconsciousness of the moral distinction. As part one opens, we see that Faust is sitting in his chamber and he's proclaiming his frustration at his state of ignorance despite his long pursuit of scientific knowledge. And I think it's at this point, Doctor, that I will ask you to read a portion from Faust's monologue for our listeners, whereafter I will provide a translation.
Yeah, with pleasure. Let me only add that I'm very grateful for your example of the preludes that are often overseen, because they show the intertextual components of this drama and this switching between macrocosmos and microcosmos. And in this scene, we see Faust in his study, a well-established, famous scholar, famous teacher who reflects on his doubts and limitations of knowledge. Habe nun, Philosophie, Juristerei und Medizin und leider auch Theologie durchaus studiert mit heißem Bemühen. Da stehe ich nun, ich armer Tor, und bin so klug als wie zuvor. Heiße Magister, heiße Doktor gar, und ziehe schon an die 10 Jahre herauf, herab und quer und krumm meine Schüler an der Nase herum. Und sehe, dass wir nichts wissen können. Das will mir schier das Herz verbrennen. Zwar bin ich gescheiter als all die Laffen, Doktoren, Magister, Schreiber und Pfaffen. Mich plagen keine Skrupel noch Zweifel, fürchte mich weder vor Hölle noch Teufel. Dafür ist mir auch alle Freud entrissen. Bilde mir nicht ein, was rechts zu wissen, bilde mir nicht ein, ich könnte was lehren, die Menschen zu bessern und zu bekehren. Auch habe ich weder Gut noch Geld, noch Ehr und Herrlichkeit der Welt. Es möchte kein Hund so länger leben. Drum habe ich mich der Magie ergeben. Ob mir durch Geisteskraft und Mund nicht manch Geheimnis würde kund, dass ich nicht mehr mit saurem Schweiß zu sagen brauche, was ich nicht weiß, dass ich erkenne, was die Welt im Innersten zusammenhält. Schau alle Wissenskraft und Samen und tu nicht mehr in Worten kramen.
Let me translate Faust's monologue in his study for the listeners. Philosophy have I digested, the whole of law and medicine. From each its secrets I have wrested, theology, alas, thrown in. Poor fool, with all this sweated lore, I stand no wiser than I was before. Master and doctor are my titles, for 10 years now, without repose. I've held my erudite recitals, and led my pupils by the nose. And round we go, on crooked ways or straight, and well I know that ignorance is our fate, and this I hate. I have, I grant, outdistanced all the others, doctors, pedants, clergy, and lay brothers. All plagues of doubts and scruples I can quell. I have no fear of devil or of hell, and in return am destitute of pleasure, knowing that knowledge tricks us beyond measure, that man's conversion is beyond my reach, knowing the emptiness of what I teach. Meanwhile I live in penury, no worldly honor falls to me. No dog would linger on like this, and so I turn to the abyss of necromancy. Try if art can voice, or power of spirit start, to do me service and reveal the things of nature's secret seal. and save me from the weary dance of holding forth in ignorance. Then shall I see with vision clear how secret elements cohere, and what the universe ingirds, and give up huckstering with words. Hoping to fulfill then his need, we hear that Faust then calls on the earth spirit, which stands for the ever-fluctuating forces of the physical universe. But again, he is disappointed, for the earth spirit, which appears in response to his summons, rejects his claims to kinship, saying, "Thou art like the spirit thou canst comprehend, not me." So he basically rejects Faust. And Faust is depressed to the point of despair at the realization that he who is presumed to see into the ultimate nature of things is indeed a mere human being, lacking the power to attain what his mind conceives. Faust says, "I am not like the gods. Feel it I must. I'm like the worm that burrows through the dust." Convinced that the only rational and dignified act remaining is to commit suicide, he puts a cup of poison to his lips. When he hears the bells and hymns announcing Christ's resurrection and his victory over corruption and death. It is Easter Day, and the unbelieving Faust is called back to life by these heavenly tones, which remind him of his childhood faith and joy. The gloom and the seriousness of the first scene of the first part is broken halfway by a humorous conversation between Faust and his attendant Wagner. This is not Wagner from opera. just to clarify, Wagner is a rather dull character who pursues the arts and sciences without any depth of understanding or imagination. And Faust, his complete spiritual opposite, makes fun of his attempts to gain wisdom through critical scholarship instead of through his soul. In the next scene outside the town gate, we see and hear common folk taking their ease on a Sunday holiday afternoon. Faust enters with Wagner and comments on how the people, like Christ, have risen from their slums and factories to the fields. He appreciates and he envies, more importantly, the common man's joy. Looking on the lovely landscape in the setting sun, Faust is seized with a longing to soar above the earth, but the human condition prevents him from doing so. Wagner confesses that he has never had such a feeling in the presence of nature, but soon gets bored and would rather be reading a good book. Faust retorts by saying, "By one impulse alone you are impressed. Oh, never learn to know the other. Two souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast, and each is fain to leave its brother. The one, fast clinging to the world that years, with clutching organs, in love's sturdy lust. The other strongly lifts itself from the dust to yonder high ancestral plains." He then calls on the spirit to lead him to a new and varied life, and it is at this moment that he notices a black poodle running in circles around him and Wagner. Faust fears a magic trap, but it is the common sense of Wagner that soon convinces him that the poodle is no spectre, no ghost, no spirit, but only a well-trained dog. Two scenes in Faust's study follow, and they present the central situation and theme of the drama. Faust enters his study accompanied by the poodle, and he is calmed by his contact with nature, filled with hope, but is then again plunged into depression when he tries to translate the New Testament, opening with the words of the Gospel of John, "In beginning with the word," but Faust is not satisfied with the term word. He tries thought, and then he tries power, and finally hits upon deed. And the primacy of action then becomes a basic notion of Faust. Doctor, my third question then for you is, what is the underlying religious view in this work, if there is indeed one? How are Orthodox Christian ideas and attitudes viewed by Faust in this play? Is Christianity just one of the elements in Goethe's view of existence? Or does his use of Christian symbols and themes provide a central framework in a similar fashion to Dante's Divine Comedy or Milton's Paradise Lost? For example, in Faust, we see a lot of respect and a lot of reverence for nature. Is there, for example, an implicitly religious viewpoint that underlies these expressions for nature as the creation of God?
One can see how the protagonists portray several extremes and viewpoints upon religion and theology, and especially the very famous Gretchen-Frage. That's the question that Gretchen asks Faust in one scene: "How do you think about religion?" leads into, one could say, a bit of confusion, because Faust is not really willing or able to answer. And she replies that he has lost his Christianity. In fact, the challenging of God's will, which is entailed by this whole play, turns out to be impossible, I would say, because even after his punishment, or the questionable resurrection or saving of Gretchen, Faust goes through a second life circle, one could say, or in a more modernist viewpoint, it's his virtual reality. But still, one can argue that God's concept has never been questioned throughout the whole play. The religious underlying tendencies, of course, as you have mentioned, the translation of the Bible by Luther, also a reflection of the times, and themes that are of very big importance, are always reflected in Goethe's works as a whole. And his upbringing in a Protestant environment shows that he has a Christian belief, but it's not very strongly bound to any confession or practice, one could say. And throughout his travel through Italy, he was very skeptical with regards to the cultural practices of church, especially the Catholic Church. So one could say that Goethe, that's the author's view, is a bit skeptical towards church as an organization. Nevertheless, one can state, especially from his later poetry, his poetry from his older age, that he had a very strong inclination towards the spiritual world, and one could also say a bit naive belief in God's will and guidance, which is interesting because also when you look at Christianity in general, my perception is that Christians do not always consider the afterlife with so much intensity like Muslims would do. So this is very interesting how Goethe tries to put light on what might happen after we are gone and what could happen after the things that we do on earth. And also this is left open to quite some extent. Whether this is only a phantasmagory or a vision that Goethe goes, or Goethe's figure Faust goes through, or if this is realistic.
The literary scholar Irving Babbitt talks about this conflict that exists between feelings of romantic restlessness and desire for religious belief. In his book entitled Rousseau and Romanticism, Rousseau obviously being one of the chief figures of the Romantic movement in France and one of the thought leaders behind movements such as the French Revolution, Irving Babbitt has this to say, I quote, "For it is perfectly true that there is something in man that is not satisfied with the finite, and that, if he becomes stationary, he is at once haunted by the spectre of ennui being restlessness. Man may indeed be defined as the insatiable animal, and the more imaginative he is, the more insatiable he is likely to become, for it is the imagination that gives him access to the infinite in every sense of the word. Now, religion seeks no less than romance and escape from ennui. However, the infinite of nostalgia has nothing in common with the infinite of religion. No distinction is more important than that between a man who feels the divine discontent of religion and the man who is suffering from mere romantic restlessness." So do you think that, having heard that commentary, do you think that Faust is somewhere between romantic restlessness and this discontent with religion?
He is, of course, in a phase of depression and being unsatisfied with his achievements. And his achievements comprise so many things. As I said, he is well known, he is famous, he has helped people, he has his students, he has so vast knowledge on all kinds of sciences, but he has this insatiable desire to explore the world on another level, one could say. He wants to expand his feelings and his sensations, not only in a sexual way, I would say. I mean, this character or protagonist is a symbol of the Romantic movement, moving away from the traditional church borders of religious thinking, and also exploring the individual and its capacities, and this longing for progress and development, lingering between romantic feelings and the scary and the dark. On one side, he's a very good example of how mankind, I would say in general, but specifically in that time, was driven between these extreme tendencies. When we look at the modern relevance of plays like this and texts like these, we can see that from a philosophical standpoint, it is a unique contrast and conflict that we humans are facing between the more spiritual or unknown and the things that we can explain with our intellect.
But moving on now to the next part, we want to discuss the character of Mephistopheles. Faust then turns his attention to the poodle that we mentioned earlier, who distracts him with whining and howling, and then suddenly begins to grow and change shape. Through magic incantations, Faust brings forth Mephistopheles, dressed as a traveling scholar. To Faust's question of his identity, he answers that he is, and I quote, "part of that power which would the evil ever do, and ever does the good. I am the spirit that denies, and rightly too, for all that doth begin should rightly to destruction run. 'Twere it better that nothing were begun. Thus everything that you call sin, destruction, in a word as evil represent, that is my own real element." A chorus of spirits, together with Mephistopheles, try to help Faust throw off his sadness and his despair and to enter into an active life again. Faust and Mephistopheles then make a contract whereby Faust will have a life of pleasure on earth in return for service to Mephistopheles hereafter, on one condition, that a moment will come in which Faust will find complete fulfillment. This is what Faust has to say, and I quote, "If to the moment I shall ever say, 'Ah, linger on, thou art so fair,' then may you your fetters on me lay, then will I perish, then and there." But of course, there are limits to what Faust might experience, even with the devil as an aid. He cannot experience all that mankind has to offer, and he cannot expand himself to include all other selves. There is a divine capacity that exists beyond human power, Mephistopheles warns. He stresses that Faust is what he is, and nothing more, a particular finite human being. Mephistopheles then appeals to Faust to leave dry reflection for the richness of concrete life, and in the soliloquy, he reveals to the audience what is behind this appeal and his judgment of Faust's character. I quote, "Humanity's most lofty power, reason and knowledge, pray despise. Let but the spirit of all lies with works of dazzling magic blind you. Then, absolutely mine, I'll have and bind you. To him has fate a spirit given that, uncurbed, ever onward sweeps, who striving by too hasty impulse driven, the joys of this earth overleaps. Him will I drag through wild life, whirling past, through all that is unmeaning and shallow stuff." In an amusing passage, Mephistopheles then dons the professional attire of Faust and advises the student on his course of studies. And he exposes the main subject of the university curriculum, interestingly enough, to biting satire. He says logic, metaphysics, law, theology, medicine, they are all useless, shallow, and dangerous disciplines. And he concludes his advice as follows. He says, "Dear friend, all theory is grey, and green the golden tree of life." Professor, my fourth question then for you is, what does Mephistopheles as a character represent? We saw in the prologue in Heaven that he's portrayed as being on speaking terms with God, who is almost fond of his wit and willing to let him be man's companion so long as he stirs man on to creative activity. And we see in the scene in Faust's study that Mephistopheles announces himself to be the spirit of negation or destruction, part of the original nothingness that preceded creation. He also described himself as always aiming at evil and always accomplishing good. What does Goethe mean by this? Is Mephistopheles similar to Milton's Satan, Milton's Lucifer, in that he is a power that wills evil, but is almost a necessary evil in that he accomplishes good without knowing it as part of the divine plan for creation?
Yeah, this Mephistopheles in Faust is indeed a witty and one could say maybe funny character in some scenes where he plays tricks on people and where he shows their intellectual limitations, and he seems to be a facilitator of Faust's wishes and desires. And like Wagner is his a bit dull adlatus and attendant, Mephistopheles is the very quick-moving spirit that can always foresee what is going to happen and is very intelligent in his moves. But he's also very ruthless, and he sacrifices the lives of Gretchen's brother and mother, and in the end herself and her child. So it's altogether not superficial what he does, but he is indeed the cause for all this destruction and negation of things that humans would like to have on Earth. But one could argue that he or Mephisto's acting leads to more critical thinking in some parts, like the scene that you've just mentioned, where he plays tricks on this pupil or student, and he shows him that, or the observer actually, how dull somebody can become when they just want to repeat things without thinking and just listen to one person and believing that is the full truth. So altogether, I think one should not underestimate the role that Goethe gives Mephisto in his play. He's a real counterpart to God, as you said, they talk one-on-one, and he has unbelievable potential and powers, but he also shows his entertaining side from time to time. But altogether, I mean more philosophically speaking, he is indeed a dark power in the play. So this satanistic figure, one could say, has the upper hand, or seemingly the upper hand, throughout the play. But when one looks at the outcome, you can still question whether or not he's so efficient.
In your previous discussion, you mentioned the character of Gretchen or Margaret. Gretchen is the diminutive form of Margaret. The rest of part one then is, for the most part, a journey through the little world of ordinary human interest, and the rest of part one centers on the character of Gretchen and the love affair that exists between Faust and Gretchen. Two extraordinary events occur. One, Faust's youth is restored through a magic elixir, and he has a vision of Helen of Troy, the image of ideal beauty. The first stop on the journey is Auerbach's cellar in Leipzig. This was an actual inn which contained murals of Faust's legend. And in preparing for our discussion today, I found out that there is a statue of Mephistopheles leading Faust that still exists outside the cellar. So that's just a fun fact. But
yeah, it's a touristic asset, I guess.
and Faust finds no satisfaction, however, in the very coarse drunkenness that's going on there, and so they move on. And the next stop they come to is the witch's kitchen, where Faust is transformed into a youth through a disgusting witch's brew. Faust then sees in the magic mirror a perfectly beautiful woman, Helen, and Mephistopheles now says that he will see a Helen in every girl that he meets. And sure enough, when he meets the maiden Margaret, or Gretchen, as I said, on the street, he falls deeply in love with her and insists that Mephistopheles must help him to win her. So it's interesting. It's almost as if Mephistopheles must now act as a diabolical wingman on Faust's behalf. But Faust is caught now in a moral dilemma, for he wants the love of this lovely and virtuous innocent girl, but he's winning, or he's going to win her love through the aid of evil powers. If he takes advantage of her love, he will ruin her. And his predicament is dramatized in a soliloquy and a dialogue with Mephistopheles in the setting of a forest and a cave. He thanks the spirit sublime, which has granted him intimacy with the depths of nature and his own soul. But this ecstasy that he experiences is impaired by his consciousness almost of his corruption. And Mephistopheles then goes on to ridicule Faust's almost prudishness at the disclosure of his underlying desires. It's almost like For those of our listeners who know the work of Freud, it's almost like a psychoanalytic taking apart of Faust's noble intentions by Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles' talk and the sexual images which he invokes impel Faust to surrender to his passion, even if it means the ruin of Gretchen himself. And he detests himself for what he's about to do. But Gretchen's readiness to give herself to him is revealed in her song at the spinning wheel. And it's at this point, Dr. Singer, that I'll ask you to read the monologue and in Margaret's room, where she is alone at the spinning wheel.
Meine Ruhe ist hin, mein Herz ist schwer, ich finde sie nimmer und nimmermehr. Wo ich ihn nicht hab, ist mir das Grab, die ganze Welt ist mir vergällt. Mein armer Kopf ist mir verrückt, mein armer Sinn ist mir zerstückt. Nach ihm nur schau ich zum Fenster hinaus, nach ihm nur gehe ich aus dem Haus. Sein hoher Gang, seine edle Gestalt, seines Mundes Lächeln, seiner Augen Gewalt und seiner Rede Zauberfluss. Sein Händedruck und ach, sein Kuss, mein Busen drängt sich nach ihm hin. Ach, dürft ich fassen und halten ihn und küssen ihn, so wie ich wollt, an seinen Küssen vergehen sollt.
It's interesting that in the ballad, in Schubert's ballad, you can actually hear in this monologue the how the piano creates the impression of the wheel, and it's the imagery. It creates the imagery of a spinning wheel, and it actually contributes to the sort of building tension and climax which Gretchen is experiencing. So let me just read the translation, or part of the translation. My peace is gone, my heart is sore, it is gone forever and forevermore. Life without him is mere distress, my eyes grow dim with bitterness. No way to reason can I find, wild fancies flutter over my mind. My peace is gone, my heart is sore, it is gone forever and forevermore. For him alone I watch all day, only for him from home I stray. His stride and style so noble and wise, his lips when they smile, oh, and the shine of his eyes. The sound of his words is honey and bliss, the touch of his hand, and oh, his kiss. My peace is gone, my heart is sore, it is gone forever and evermore. My bosom stirs, my heart will pine, to touch him and hold him and have him for mine, and kiss him too, my joy to crown, and let his kisses my senses drown. And then we come on to the play which you mentioned earlier, which is where before Gretchen decides to give herself to Faust, she has questions about his religious beliefs, and Faust puts off her dislike of the character of Mephistopheles to the fact that, oh, Mephistopheles is just a bit of a strange character, and that's why she dislikes him. He's unique, he's not for everyone, but at the end of the day, he's ultimately a good guy. And so that he may then spend the night with Gretchen, he induces her to administer a sleeping potion to her mother. And then a lot happens in the next scene. It's sort of similar to Greek tragedy when we did Sophocles' Oedipus the King. All the action happens off stage. It's very different. It's very different from modern film, where everything is portrayed and nothing is left to the human imagination. But anyways, the next scene reveals that Gretchen is pregnant, regretful for her sin and the public condemnation that will follow. She prays to the Virgin Mary for mercy and salvation. Her brother Valentine is furious at Gretchen's pregnancy because it will make him the butt of the joke and he will be dishonored by her shame. He tries to kill Faust, but Faust, aided by Mephistopheles' diabolical powers, murders him. After the duel, the dying Valentine coarsely curses his sorrowing Gretchen. He describes his sister as a common whore who will soon be the convenience of all men and end up a social pariah. In the next scene at the cathedral, Gretchen is overcome by a sense of guilt and death at her brother and her mother, who has now died from the sleeping potion. Doctor, my question then is with regards to the character of Gretchen. What is Gretchen doing in the story of Dr. Faustus? She doesn't appear in the original legend of Dr. Faustus, which is the source material wherefrom Goethe made his play. So why does Goethe stress such an ordinary love affair in a drama that is concerned with the deepest and most basic concerns of human existence? Is there maybe, some commentators have said, is there maybe a real life, a basis in reality for Gretchen's love story in Goethe's own life, in his own youthful love affairs? Those who know Goethe well will know of Charlotte in The Sorrows of Young Werther. Is there perhaps a parallel between them? And why does Goethe use Gretchen? What is her function in the story of Goethe's Faust?
Yeah, that makes me laugh because we know that Goethe's feminine figures in his real life have been numerous. So it would be hard to draw a parallel to a specific character. But yes, there have been many women, especially in his earlier years, but there were some of more importance. And if you look at his relationship to Charlotte von Stein, there's even a relationship that one could call mother and son kind of love, and all kinds of variations of relationships. So personally, I would be reluctant to say Gretchen is a incarnation of a specific figure in Goethe's life. But she is, of course, an example of womanhood as such, like Helena is a metaphor for a feminine figure. And this is, I think, quite explicitly said or put out in this play. She seems to be naive, but if you look at her development and the questions that she asks, actually, and the conclusions that she draws sometimes, she is even an energy in the play that forces us to rethink what's happening. And she also questions Faust's belief. She's easily convinced, but we shall not forget there's magic in play. So we have the magic potion and evil powers, as you said. On the other hand, she is a very typical example of female roles in world literature who are just of minor evidence or importance for the play. So I remember one actress saying, I would never read or play Gretchen because she's just a victim. She's just a young woman who gets killed in the end. So that makes you laugh. But if you look at her monologue more closely, it's not just her being in love, but being unstabilized in her life. She's not just a romantic person, but she questions how she can move on with this immense power of love that has hit her. While Faust knows about the dangers that will come with this kind of relationship, he risks her life in a way to achieve the pleasures that he has his bet with Mephisto.
But to quote one of these commentators, Erich Heller, in his book The Disinherited Mind, he says, "What is Faust's sin? Restlessness of spirit. What is Faust's salvation? Restlessness of spirit. This confusion lies in a perpetual crisscrossing of restless strivings of different quality, the striving for peace, the striving for sensation, or to put it differently and in terms of the contentment sort, the striving for the peace that passeth all understanding," a reference to the Bible, and striving for a state of calm, which is merely a state of emotional exhaustion. These two kinds of striving perpetually get into each other's way throughout the poem. Of these two strivings, one desires the attainment of the Superman. I think Erich Heller is referring to Nietzsche's Übermensch there, and the alchemist heightening of human faculties, where the other aims at renunciation and resignation to the simple state of man. The first is the native element of Goethe's genius, and the second, the longing of Goethe's moral existence. And this is funny because this touches on something we also did in St. Augustine's Confessions, mentioning the peace that passes all understanding. Some theologians say that this restlessness which man feels, being partly finite, partly infinite, St. Augustine's Confessions opens with the lines that man will always be restless until his soul rests in thee being God. Do you have any commentary on what Heller has described there?
Well, you can draw a parallel to Goethe's earlier works in his Sturm und Drang phase, the storm and, how do you call it? Uneasiness.
Storm and stress.
And stress, where he's the more rebellious and progressive, one could say, author who questions God in another way, in his Prometheus poem, for instance.
I think we should move towards the end of the play now. The tragedy of Faust. Preceding the tragic conclusion of the first part comes the Vulpergus night scenes, which you mentioned earlier, at the annual festival of the witches. And these scenes are the wildest in the work. They throw together a group of spirits from legend and from Goethe's imagination, and they combine obscene humor, wonderful fantasy, and very engaging verse rhythm. And apparently, some commentators have said Mephistopheles' purpose in bringing Faust to the witches' sabbath is to distract him from the tragic reality of human existence, i.e., the results of his affair with Gretchen. But Faust is dancing with a beautiful young witch, and a red mouse jumps out of her mouth. I've not been able to determine exactly what the red mouse signifies, but once he sees the red mouse, his pleasure turns to disgust. And in that moment, he has a vision of Gretchen in chains. There's a bit of an exchange between Faust and Mephistopheles, who Mephistopheles regards Gretchen as just one amongst many fallen souls amongst thousands. And this reminds me of Dante's Divine Comedy, where he describes the fallen as autumn leaves that fall from the tree and fall on the ground. But then Faust agrees Faust, funnily enough, then agrees to help free Gretchen from prison. We come to the prison scene, and in prison, Faust finds Gretchen insane, possessed with guilt and remorse, for she had drowned her child. She committed infanticide. And her sad songs again give a poignancy to the scenes that remind us of something like it reminds us of something like Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Gretchen says, "Torn lies the wreath," she laments, "scattered the flowers are." When she comes to her senses and recognizes Faust, though, she's overjoyed and full of love for him, but she feels too weighed down by the bonds of sin and guilt. And she doesn't want to flee with him, for she says there's no hope for her anymore. The images of her child drowning, her mother falling into an eternal sleep, condemn her and torment her. And she says, "I've done all for love of you." That's what she says to Faust. And she foresees the scene of her execution by beheading. When Mephistopheles comes to take Faust away, she urges that this devil, this queer figure, be thrust out from this holy place. And she calls on the heavenly host to protect her from Faust. And the play ends in a kind of whirlwind. We have Margaret being Gretchen. Henry is Faust's first name. There's an interesting, I came across a piece of commentary that said in positive scenes, they refer to, Faust refers to her as Gretchen, but in negative scenes or in difficult scenes, he refers to her as Margaret. But anyways, she says, "Henry, I shrink from you." Mephistopheles says, "She is judged." A voice from above, presumably God, "She is saved." Mephistopheles to Faust, "Here to me," and he disappears with Faust. And a voice from within, Margaret saying, "Henry, Henry," fading away. Now, a lot goes on in this last part of the drama. And so my final question for you, Doctor, is Faust a tragedy? We spoke at the beginning, we said, man striving and aspiring errs, but through his striving comes to ultimate rightness and salvation. Is Faust a tragedy in this way, or is there perhaps an idea that we ought to expand our ancient notion of tragedy, the Greek understanding of tragedy? Erich Heller, again, a distinguished critic of German literature, says that Goethe might have created a new kind of tragedy, a sentimental one, a tragedy of human feeling. So how does this, first of all, is Faust a tragedy? And how does it as a tragedy differ from something like what Aristotle discusses in the Poetics?
I mean, technically speaking, the second title of the drama is Eine Tragödie. So Goethe conceptualized the work as a tragedy. But as you said, it's his own version of a tragedy. I mean, formally speaking, with these 28 scenes in the first part, and I think 5 larger scenes in the second part, and this reflecting and shifting between the macrocosmos and the microcosmos, it is in itself an opus magnum, and it contains more than just tragical elements. But we can see that the romantic love between Gretchen and Faust has been destroyed, and also his righteous achievements and aims have been destroyed through his pact with Mephistopheles. So both live through their own tragedies, and they have their tragedies together, and Faust is also in many ways, or can be seen as a parable on mankind and the conditio humana, where we all try to strive for the wrong things in a way that maybe produce good side effects. So there's learning on the way, there is imagination and interaction and many experiences, but the outcome is, I would stress, tragic indeed.
I like that. This is one of the ideas that I like about Faust, or one of the ideas I think that he's putting forward is that this idea that in striving, you can bring about good through striving, that, you know, that action is as we said, action is the primary theme of Faust. And
yes, and this is why it's not just a contemplative work. I mean, a text that you would sit down with and study like a philosophical text. It has to be played. It has to be experienced. I think this is very important for Goethe.
In a book entitled, a very famous book entitled The Dehumanization of Art and Other Essays by Ortega Gasset, he has this to say about the tragic element of Goethe's Faust. He says, an enormous part of Goethe's work presents us with beings who go about the world searching for their inner destiny or fleeing it. What constituted tragedy used to be that a terrible exterior fate fell upon a man, a fate so unequivocal and inevitable that the unfortunate man succumbed under it. But the tragedy of Faust is exactly the opposite. In Faust, what constitutes the drama is that a man sets out in search of his inner destiny and goes wandering through the universe without ever finding his life. In the former case, life encounters problems. In the latter case, life itself is the problem.
Yeah, it also shows on a more shallow note that life has to happen. We cannot just sit and wait for our fate to end our life, but we have to experience things. This is, I think, the takeaway message as well.
Doctor, thank you very much. I would like to end the podcast now on a more personal note by asking you what your favorite piece of literature is and why, maybe besides Goethe's Faust. And then perhaps a larger question, what are your hopes for the future of humanities and maybe higher education at South African universities? I know it's a big question. But if you could just give us the spark notes, that would be wonderful.
Let me just express my gratitude for your patience with my English. I have discovered my own limitations because I must add, when we teach literature, even here on campus with South African students, I always try to make language and the ideas in literature available to students. So we would rather work with smaller snippets and maybe poems or parts of narrative texts that are more easily understandable for students in portions that they can handle. But I would be thrilled to do this piece that we are talking about with students, maybe with honors students or master students. And I'm always intrigued by the more classical authors and the more canonized authors of German-speaking literature. But I also have a great interest in migrant narratives and authors. And this is what I like to share with students right now, to get them acquainted with the sociological implications of what it means to be in German-speaking countries and what is happening there. And I must add, this is something that is actually missing in the drama of Faust. I think the political implications are a bit on the side. When you look at the folk scenes and the public and the soldiers and the students, they are very stereotypical in their ways. And also, this is something that you could question about working with these texts. Are they still of political relevance? I would say yes, because our thinking and beliefs about moral are always politically intertwined. So I would never say there are texts that we shouldn't read anymore because they have been written 2 or 3 or whatever 100 years ago. You can always add or find out questions that are of unique and everlasting relevance, I would say. Personally, I cannot tell you which text is my favorite because there are too many. And when I rediscover poetry like I do now with second years, I even look back and say, wow, this is so rich and there's so many new details to discover. there's always new and also old literature that can be of actual relevance.
I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. I did a term of German as a second additional language in high school, and I just managed to get through. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you, but I also take your point that cultural knowledge is always historical knowledge, and it's more than just an acquaintance with these past human achievements. So it's about a lot more than just there's a difference, I always say, between knowing about Faust and knowing Faust, because there are some people who they know about the Shakespeare plays, but they haven't exercised their cultural responsibility through critical assessment, and by doing that, they haven't internalized the play, because it's only when you internalize the play, as it were, you culturally appropriate it for yourself, that you really come to appreciate the play. Because what often happens at universities is that young people, they come to university, and it's, for many of them, it's the closest they will ever come to higher education, higher things of culture. But I don't think you can enter upon I don't think you can become an educated person, because the moment you try and look at the sources of this knowledge, you see that there's you enter upon an entire cultural legacy that's been left by your predecessors. And so you cannot be, I guess you can, but it wouldn't do for me justice to the greatness of these works to be educated in that very superficial way. It's actually interesting, in Goethe's Faust, there are these wonderful lines: "What from your father's heritage is lent, earn it anew to really possess it. What serves not is a sore impediment. The moment's need creates the things to serve and bless it." That's unfortunately all we have time for today on the Great Conversation podcast. Doctor, thank you so much for sharing some of your valuable time and insight with us today. To our listeners at home, please remember to subscribe to the Great Conversation podcast, and remember to tune in next week, where we will be discussing Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Thank you very much, Doctor.
It's only a pleasure. Thank you.